Welcome to Mr. Otway's Utility Room, where I'm going to make a bit of a podcast for you, this time whilst doing the ironing, because I think this way I can kill two birds with one stone. And what I'm going to talk to you about here is one of the two wartime conferences. Well, the second one wasn't really strictly a wartime conference, certainly because the war in Europe had finished, but the war in Asia hadn't yet. What am I jabbering on about? Well, first we're going to learn about the Yalta Conference in this particular podcast, and then I'm going to tell you a bit about the Potsdam Conference. And I've written down some bits on this back of this envelope, so I'll make sure that I don't forget certain things that I need to tell you. Well, I often think of the Yalta Conference as a bit like the honeymoon period as the war's drawing to a close. The three in the Grand Alliance, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, had got on so well to the extent that now the defeat of the Nazis was pretty much inevitable. And some decisions were taken at Yalta, and the atmosphere seemed to be generally fairly positive. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the agreements that were made, but some of the things that the Grand Alliance disagreed on. And the reason why I think I should talk to you about Yalta quite a bit is because this is something that could come up on your exam, potentially. In the past there has been an exam question which has been specifically about the Potsdam and Yalta conferences, so we need to have a fairly detailed understanding of them, but also some of the context and some of the background. And there's a really interesting wartime cartoon which I've seen recently, which shows Hitler as Cupid, which is a bit bizarre, so it kind of stands out. But he's Cupid, and he's pointing his love's arrow at Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin. And the message of the cartoon is that the only thing that's keeping these three, well, not in love, but in a decent relationship, is Hitler. And I think that's quite apt, actually, because as we mentioned in class, the only reason there was really a Grand Alliance is because there was a need to get rid of Hitler. I'm just going to get a chair, so I can put the ironing down. Anyway, the reason why Hitler could be seen as Cupid is, if we put it into context a little bit, is some of the things that happened before the Second World War and why these were so unlikely as being allies together. Well, first of all, there was something called a Red Scare in the United States in the 1920s, where lots of immigrants, because there were a lot of immigrants that came to America to pursue the American dream, well, they were persecuted for their political views if they were suspected of communism, because America was quite scared of communism, being as it was such a capitalist country where sort of money makes the world go around sort of thing. In Britain, there was a general strike in 1926. It was a really famous, huge event, and it was dealt with really harshly. And one reason for this was because the British government was panicking that it was communist agents that were behind the general strike trying to destabilise the government. So America and Britain are very suspicious that the Soviet Union are trying to spread communism through the world. And we know about the organisation Comintern, which the purpose of Comintern was to spread communism around the world. At the same time, if we rewind a little bit to the Bolshevik Revolution, the British and Americans actually sent troops to Russia to try to overthrow the Bolshevik regime when it first started. So there's no reason for these guys to be allies. At Yalta, though, they were allies, and they'd been fairly successful in, getting towards, but not quite yet, defeating the Nazis. Things they agreed upon was Japan. America was quite anxious to get the USSR to help them to invade and defeat Japan, because although they were developing the atomic bomb, there was no guarantee that A, they'd work, and B, that the Japanese would surrender despite that, because the Japanese were fairly fanatical fighters. And so there was a potential for a cost of thousands and thousands of American lives trying to conquer the Japanese homelands. So Roosevelt wanted Stalin's cooperation. In return, the Soviets would get some land in northern Asia, and the Soviets agreed to this and said that as soon as the war in Europe had been won, they would join in and help to defeat Japan in the east. Which turned out to be quite a good deal for Stalin and the USSR, because they didn't really have to do much fighting, because the atomic bomb was dropped and Japan surrendered later on in, I think, August 6th and August 9th, 1945. The other thing they agreed upon was that Germany should be divided into 4 zones, and that Berlin should also be divided into 4 zones, because Berlin was the capital where all the German wealth was. They decided that they would also hunt down Nazi war criminals, and that they would establish the United Nations, which is now it's one of the key points that we need to be aware of. So the United Nations was supposed to be this organisation led by the leading, most powerful nations in the world to try to prevent there being a war ever again in the future. But then the two contentious issues. They agreed at Yalta, and they specifically announced that this was going to be the case, that they would have free elections in liberated countries, and they made something which was called the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which is that they would have free elections. The problem with this is the interpretation of what free elections meant, because they both agreed it. So free elections? Free elections? Yes, it's very good. Ah, yeah, that's fantastic. Very good, yes. So they agreed all this, just like that perhaps. But behind the scenes, the interpretation of democracy to Stalin was communist parties, which represented the people. And because he believed that only communist parties could represent the people, the working class, and to help society stay equal. So, whereas Roosevelt and Churchill perhaps were thinking that Stalin was going to let any political party take part in democratic elections, he wasn't necessarily going to let that happen. And it was a particular problem when it came to Poland. The other thing is that Stalin was, he was paranoid. He was a paranoid man. But the Russians had a reason to be paranoid, because people kept trying to invade them and causing millions of deaths, as had just happened. So they wanted a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And Roosevelt and Churchill were willing to agree to that. Now, things they disagreed on. Well, they weren't happy when Roosevelt and Churchill about this idea that Poland would move west. So that the Soviets would take a chunk of Poland, and in return Poland would get a chunk of Germany. Now the Soviets wanted this because they thought that part of Poland was traditionally and should have been part of Russia, but also for security purposes, and perhaps as well to try to weaken Germany somewhat by taking a chunk of Germany away, because they're quite worried because Germany had invaded them twice. There was another thing, Churchill was happy about this, but Churchill in the end decided that it was worth letting that happen if Stalin agreed not to interfere in Greece, where there was a civil war between communists and anti-communists who were backed by Britain. And Stalin was quite happy to agree to that. So Churchill managed to convince Roosevelt, and everything was passed around. But they disagreed, and they argued about Poland quite a lot. They also disagreed because there was the Lublin government, which had been set up by Stalin, and there was the London Polish government, which was the Polish government in exile, which had left the country upon the Nazi invasion in September 1st, 1939. Now, Stalin had brought these Lublin Poles, who were communists, and decided to recognise them as the official government of Poland, whereas the USA and Britain were quite upset about this. Like, well, no, they're the government. We've had them in London all through the war, and we went to war in the first place to ensure the freedom for Poland. So there was a problem there. Now, first of all, the problems after this, because they agreed it, they all went, brilliant, we've all made these agreements, okay, we weren't all happy about them, but we had to compromise. So they went home. Whilst home, they started to realise that this interpretation of democracy was different. So Stalin thought democracy was, well, yeah, you can have votes, but only between different communist parties. And the other one was because this Polish compromise was just impossible. Because the West are insisting on free elections, and Stalin's insisting on a Poland that is friendly to the USSR. Problem is, Stalin had done war crimes in Poland at the start of the war. Well, the Soviet Union had. And there's all sorts of other historical reasons why the Poles would never vote for any party, en masse anyway, which would support the USSR. So if you have free elections, you're not going to end up with a government in Poland that is friendly towards the USSR. So either Stalin has to impose a government in Poland, or there's going to be free elections, and there's not going to be a friendly government in Poland. Well, Stalin's in control of Poland because the Red Army is there, so we all know what happened. And Roosevelt, before he died, and he was quite ill at the Yalta Conference, he wasn't far away from passing away, but before he died he seemed to be quite upset that Stalin was not carrying through his promise of free elections in Poland. The other thing which is really interesting to note, which I've written down here on my envelope, is that in March 1945, bearing in mind that Yalta was in February 1945, Stalin had asked for some of the leaders of the Polish resistance during the war to come and meet him, 16 of them to be precise, and he promised, you come to see me, I promise you your safety, and we'll discuss the future of Poland, we'll come to some sort of agreement. And the 16 Poles, they turned up, were arrested and never seen again. So this is something that would naturally upset the Allies, particularly Britain, who'd gone to war in the first place over Poland. And another interesting point is behind the scenes, though there was this friendly, yeah, we've made these compromises and these decisions, Churchill in May, just 3 months after this conference and when the war ended, ordered his main general, who was called General Montgomery, to not destroy German weaponry in case it had to be used against the Russians, in case the Russians tried to keep going and take more land further west. So that's an interesting development. On the face of it, Churchill's willing to make deals with Stalin, and they're quite friendly, and there's pictures of them at the conference all sat there looking happy, and they seem to go home, and it was heralded as Yalta as quite a triumph that they were managing to coexist peacefully in a peaceful world and make these deals. But behind the scenes, things aren't all as they seem. Churchill's preparing for the possibility of the Russians carrying on. So that's the Yalta Conference. I think I've told you everything that's on my paper here. Yes, I have. So there were some deals, if I was to sum up, there were some deals made, particularly over Germany, United Nations and Poland, and there were some disagreements on what would happen between those bits, but things hadn't broken down entirely yet. Potsdam Conference next.